Have you ever sat in your living room, maybe after a quiet dinner or while folding laundry, and thought to yourself, how did I get here? Not physically, but emotionally. Maybe you've done everything right. You worked hard, gave your children love, support, and every bit of yourself, and yet something feels hollow. Maybe it's not something you even say out loud, but it's there. That deep ache of being unseen, unheard, and sometimes unloved. You're not alone in that feeling. And if you're a parent of an adult child who consistently centers everything around themselves, that loneliness you feel may have roots far deeper than you realized. It's not just about physical distance, it's emotional. It's the kind of isolation that comes when the person you gave everything to turns around and makes you feel like you were never enough. Or worse, like you never mattered. Today, I want to speak gently and honestly to that pain, because it's real. And for many parents over 60, this is a truth that's rarely talked about. We speak about caregiving, about wills, about aging, but not often about what happens when your own child becomes the source of your deepest emotional wound. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about what it's like to be a parent in a family where unhealthy patterns have taken root, not in you, but in the very child you raised. And more importantly, let's talk about why you may feel so profoundly lonely, and what you can begin to do about it. Now, I know labels get used loosely these days, but I'm not talking about the occasional selfie or someone who enjoys a compliment. I'm talking about deeply ingrained behavior patterns that create chaos in families, where love feels conditional, empathy is absent, and control or emotional pressure replaces real connection. If your child regularly dismisses your feelings, constantly makes everything about themselves, or blames you for their problems regardless of the facts, those are patterns we can't ignore. Let's begin with the first, and perhaps the most foundational reason so many parents in this situation feel empty: the lack of emotional support. When you were raising your child, you likely poured yourself into their needs. Their scraped knees, their school projects, their broken hearts. You were there. You might have missed out on things for yourself, maybe friendships, hobbies, even self-care, because parenting always came first. And maybe, like many loving parents, you assumed that one day, when your child grew up, they'd naturally offer you that same level of emotional care. But some adult children don't operate that way. They often view relationships through a one-sided lens of, what can you do for me, rather than, how can we support each other? So when the tables turn and you need comfort, advice, or even just a simple check-in phone call, it doesn't happen. And that absence leaves a space inside you where mutual love should be, that simply echoes. You may start to question your worth. You might wonder, did I do something wrong? Was I too soft? Too strict? Did I spoil them? The truth is, parenting isn't an exact science. And no one deserves emotional neglect, especially not from their own child. But when that support is missing, it shakes the very core of your identity as a parent. You gave your heart, and now it feels like there's nothing coming back. That brings us to something that often goes hand in hand with emotional neglect: invisibility. If you've ever felt like your presence in your child's life is just optional, you're not imagining things. Parents in these situations often find themselves ignored, pushed to the sidelines, or treated like a convenience. You may only hear from them when they need something. Your opinions may be brushed off. You might be left out of important life events, or included only as an afterthought. The worst part? You may have spent years being the only person who truly showed up for them. And yet now, it's as if you've faded into the background of their life story. Like a ghost at the edge of the photo album. That feeling of being unseen. It doesn't just hurt, it's disorienting. Because your role as a parent was once central, meaningful, full of purpose. And now, even when you're present, you feel invisible. Sometimes, adult children go even further. They rewrite history. They minimize your sacrifices or twist memories to cast themselves as the victim. That's when the next layer of pain sets in. Emotional manipulation. This can be especially confusing, particularly if you were raised in a generation where respect, duty, and selflessness were core values. Some adult children know how to use those very values against you. They may rely on guilt. They might say things like, "If you really loved me, you'd pay for this." Or, "You never supported me. You always cared more about appearances," even when those claims are far from the truth. This kind of manipulation chips away at your reality. It makes you doubt your own memories. You start to wonder if maybe you are the problem. You might replay past conversations in your head, trying to figure out where you went wrong, how you could have prevented the current estrangement, or how to fix it now. But here's the hard truth. You can't fix what they don't want to heal. And you didn't cause a disorder that likely took root long before you could even see it. The self-doubt, though, can be paralyzing. You stop reaching out. You start second-guessing yourself even in other relationships, with friends, with extended family. And little by little, you build a shell around your heart, a protective layer to avoid being hurt again. But that shell, it also locks in the loneliness. And behind all of that, the neglect, the invisibility, the manipulation, there's another hidden wound: the erosion of personal boundaries. You see, some adult children struggle to respect the line between parent and child, especially once they become adults. They may demand time, money, or attention in ways that cross healthy limits, and when you try to push back, you're accused of being selfish or uncaring. Over time, you may feel like walking on eggshells is the only way to keep the peace. You might have noticed that your boundaries don't feel like yours anymore. Maybe you let them slide just to avoid a fight. Or maybe you never had the chance to build strong ones in the first place, because for decades, your focus was on keeping your family together. But here's what happens when boundaries dissolve. Your identity goes with them. You stop being you and start becoming whatever keeps things quiet: a wallet, a babysitter, a guilt receptor. And inside, your true self gets smaller and smaller. That's why, even when you're surrounded by others, neighbors, a community group, even other family members, you may still feel profoundly, heartbreakingly alone. Because your real self hasn't had space to breathe in a long time. But let me gently remind you of something. Your story isn't over. And just because someone else doesn't see your value, doesn't mean you've lost it. You are not invisible to everyone. You're still here, still listening, still seeking truth. And that means you still have power. The power to rebuild, redefine, and reconnect. Maybe you've been told, directly or indirectly, that you're being too sensitive, or you take things too personally. And after hearing that long enough, you start to wonder, am I really the problem? That kind of thinking doesn't come out of nowhere. It's often the result of years, even decades, of subtle emotional conditioning from someone you love. Someone who, instead of honoring your boundaries, has consistently pushed past them and blamed you for reacting. Over time, this drains something sacred: your sense of self. You may not even notice it at first. It starts small. A request you say yes to, even though you're exhausted. A comment that stings, but you let it slide. A pattern that becomes a lifestyle, where your needs come last, or not at all. And here's the hardest part. Many parents in these situations keep trying long after they should have let go. Not because they're weak, but because they love deeply. Because they remember the baby they once held in their arms, the child they raised through scraped knees, school plays, and late-night fevers. But that memory of who your child once was can blind you to the reality of who they are now. And when the person standing in front of you uses your love against you, love begins to feel like a trap instead of a gift. This leads to something most parents never expect to feel: fear. Not the kind of fear you had when they were teenagers coming home late or when they got their first car. This is a different kind of fear, a quieter one. The fear of abandonment. You may not say it out loud, but it's there in the background. You worry. If I speak up, they'll cut me off. If I say no, they won't let me see the grandkids. If I tell them how much they hurt me, they'll disappear forever. And so you silence yourself. You shrink your needs. You pretend things are okay even when they clearly aren't. You walk on those eggshells because the alternative, Their absence feels like too much to bear. But here's the thing, that fear becomes its own prison. It traps you in a cycle where the only connection you have is one that constantly hurts you. And in the process, you lose something you can never get back unless you fight for it: your emotional freedom. This kind of fear can also keep you from forming new connections. You might hesitate to open up to friends, even trusted ones, because you're afraid they'll judge you or say, "But they're your child," as if that explains everything. As if blood should excuse abuse. It doesn't. Love is meant to be mutual. Respect is not optional. And boundaries are not acts of betrayal. They are acts of survival. But when your child punishes you for trying to have those boundaries, by withdrawing affection, ghosting you for weeks, or even turning other family members against you, it can feel impossible to hold your ground. So instead, you isolate. You retreat. You become quiet. And in that quiet, loneliness takes root. This isn't just being alone on a Friday night. It's a kind of loneliness that sits deep in your chest. It follows you to the grocery store, whispers to you in church, sits with you during your morning coffee. It tells you no one would understand. That your story is too complicated. That you'll just sound bitter. So you stay silent. You smile and say you're fine, even when you're breaking inside. That kind of isolation is soul deep. And it doesn't always come from having no one around. Sometimes you do have people in your life, friends, siblings, even a partner. But the wound your child leaves is so raw, so personal, that you feel completely alone in carrying it. You may have tried to talk to others about it. Maybe someone at your book club or your sister or someone at the senior center. And maybe their answer was something like, "All kids are like that these days," or "I'm sure they don't mean it." But they're wrong, because they haven't lived your story. They don't know what it's like to watch your own child look through you like you're invisible, or worse, treat you like a burden or a villain in their story. The truth is, some adult children isolate their parents on purpose. They create emotional distance, not only by pulling away themselves, but by quietly separating you from others as well. They may say things to relatives or friends that cast you in a negative light. Or they make you feel so ashamed or uncomfortable that you stop reaching out altogether. That's part of their control. Keeping you alone means keeping you under their emotional thumb. But you don't have to stay there. You can begin to rebuild the parts of yourself that have been chipped away over the years. You can reconnect with your identity, not just as a parent, but as a whole person with your own dreams, needs, and voice. Start small. Maybe it's writing down a few truths about yourself each morning. Maybe it's calling that friend you've been meaning to talk to. Maybe it's finally telling someone the real story, not the version you soften to make others comfortable. You deserve to be heard. You deserve to be believed. And you deserve to be supported, not just as someone's parent, but as someone who's lived a long life full of effort, love, and sacrifice. There's no shame in having a difficult child. But there is danger in letting that difficulty define your worth. Sometimes healing begins by saying, "This is not okay, and I'm not crazy for feeling this way." And no matter what they tell you, no matter how they twist your words, rewrite the past, or ignore your heart, you are not invisible. You are not the problem. And you are not alone. At some point, usually after many quiet nights and long inner conversations, something begins to stir inside you. It's not anger. It's not even sadness anymore. It's a gentle but firm realization that living this way, constantly shrinking yourself to keep someone else comfortable, is slowly draining the life out of you. And that realization, as painful as it is, can also be the beginning of something new. You may have spent years believing that being a good parent meant enduring anything. That unconditional love required unlimited tolerance. That if you just stayed patient enough, kind enough, and forgiving enough, things would eventually improve. But when deeply unhealthy behavior patterns are involved, patience alone doesn't heal the relationship. Instead, it often deepens the wound. One of the most difficult truths to face is this: you can love your child and still acknowledge that the relationship is hurting you. Those two things can exist at the same time. And recognizing that doesn't make you cold, selfish, or heartless. It makes you honest. Many parents in your position struggle deeply with emotional connection. Not because you don't want closeness, but because closeness has become dangerous. Every time you open your heart, it feels like it's used against you. Your words are twisted. Your intentions are questioned. Your feelings are minimized or ignored. So eventually, you learn to protect yourself by pulling back emotionally. But here's the quiet cost of that protection. When you shut down emotionally with your child, you often end up shutting down with everyone else too. You stop sharing. You stop trusting. You stop reaching. And slowly, your world gets smaller. This is how loneliness settles in, not all at once, but little by little. You may notice that conversations feel shallow now, that you hold back parts of yourself, even with people who care. You may feel disconnected from joy, unsure how to relax fully, always bracing for the next emotional hit. That's not weakness. That's the nervous system of someone who has been on emotional alert for far too long. One of the most important steps forward is understanding that your need for connection is not wrong. Wanting warmth, respect, and emotional safety is not asking for too much. It's asking for the bare minimum of a healthy human relationship. And this is where boundaries become not just helpful, but necessary. For many parents over 60, the word boundaries can feel uncomfortable. You may have grown up in a time when boundaries weren't discussed openly, especially within families. You were taught to give, to sacrifice, to endure. But boundaries are not walls meant to punish others. They are doors meant to protect your inner peace. A boundary might mean not engaging in conversations where you're being blamed or criticized. It might mean limiting how often you answer the phone. It might mean saying no without explaining yourself for the 100th time. And yes, it might feel terrifying at first, especially if your child reacts with anger, silence, or guilt. That reaction does not mean your boundary is wrong. It often means it's working. What you're really doing is reclaiming your identity. You are no longer only someone's parent. You are a whole person with a lifetime of experiences, values, and wisdom. You are allowed to have preferences. You are allowed to change. You are allowed to protect your emotional health. Another painful but freeing step is releasing the fear of abandonment. This doesn't mean pretending it won't hurt if your child pulls away. Of course it will. Losing connection with your child, even temporarily, can feel like losing a limb. But living in constant fear of abandonment often leads to self-abandonment. And that's a loss no one should have to endure. Ask yourself gently, without judgment, how much of myself have I given up just to avoid being left? Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop chasing someone who keeps running away from accountability. Not out of spite, but out of self-respect. You are not responsible for managing your child's emotions, reactions, or choices. You are responsible for your own well-being. And that's where healing truly begins. Healing doesn't always look dramatic. Often, it's quiet. It's choosing to spend time with people who treat you kindly. It's rediscovering hobbies you once loved. It's allowing yourself moments of peace without guilt. It's learning to enjoy your own company again, not because you've given up on others, but because you've come home to yourself. You may find strength in support groups, counseling, or even simply talking honestly with one trusted person. You may find comfort in journaling, prayer, or walking in nature. There is no single right path, only the path that brings you back to feeling whole. And please hear this clearly. Having a child who behaves this way does not mean you failed as a parent. These patterns are complex. They are shaped by many factors, including temperament, environment, and experiences that were never fully within your control. Blaming yourself only keeps the cycle of pain going. You did the best you could with what you knew at the time. That matters. Loneliness may still visit from time to time. Healing doesn't erase the past, but it can soften the ache. It can give you new connections, deeper peace, and a renewed sense of purpose. It can remind you that life still holds meaning, even after disappointment. You still matter. Your voice still matters. Your life is not over. It's simply entering a new chapter. If any part of this message resonates with you, I invite you to share your thoughts or experiences in the comments. Your story may help someone else feel less alone. And if you found this video helpful, please take a moment to like it and subscribe to Strong Elderly Life. This channel is here to support you with honest conversations, encouragement, and tools for living with strength and dignity at every stage of life. Thank you for spending this time with me. Be gentle with yourself. You've carried a lot for a very long time. And you deserve peace, connection, and respect, now and always. Here's to living your best life at any age.